In these dark days of rising tensions between the United States and Canada, today I want to take you back to an even darker time when the two nations were at war. But we're not going to do a war story today. Instead, we're going to do a peace story. We're going to recount this incredible tale of this time when two towns, one on either side of an international war between two nations, decided to go their own way and choose peace. Calais, Maine, and St. Stephen, New Brunswick have always enjoyed what journalist J.C. Furness called an imaginary border. For the vast majority of their history, they had basically simply ignored the border. There was even, at one point, a streetcar line that went straight across the border. Their closeness had begun much earlier than that, though. Almost immediately after the very first settlements in the two towns, the Calais side experienced its first ever murder after a deputy was killed by a counterfeiter. The deputy's body was buried on the St. Stephen side for the very simple and frankly difficult to argue with logic that the deputy's family thought that their graveyard was prettier. The two towns' close relationship, though, faced its toughest test during the War of 1812 when their respective nations went to war.
You're listening to Backyard History, the hidden stories that happened in your own backyard, the podcast version of the weekly history column running in newspapers across the Maritimes, with your host and author, Andrew McLean.
The War of 1812 had actually been raging for 11 days before the news finally reached the two border communities.
On Saturday, June 27th, 1812, we received the unwelcome news of war being proclaimed.
Local preacher Duncan McCall wrote in his diary. The following day was a Sunday, so naturally everyone went to church. Relationships between the two towns had long been so close that Duncan McCall's parishioners were an even mix of people from both sides of the border. That Sunday, the mood amongst McCall's congregation was dark. Everyone knew the news that they were now at war. Yet the people still assembled the exact same way as they would have any other Sunday, streaming over the border to attend church services. This service was different, though. There was a grim and foreboding sense that this would be the end. The assembled congregants were deeply and painfully aware that it was likely the last time that they would ever see their friends and family on the other side of the border, because they would soon be told to kill one another because of the war. Duncan McCall wrote in his diary,
I could hardly make out to preach with the people sobbing and weeping.
His congregation, he continued, thought that
this could be the last time they could meet in peace.
Duncan McCall, a 55-year-old preacher, was deeply affected by seeing the pain the war was already causing amongst neighbors, loved ones, and friends, even though armed conflict had yet to touch the region. The preacher himself was certainly no stranger to war. He had actually first come to the United States decades earlier as a British soldier with a mission to defeat the American Revolution. Duncan McCall had joined the British Army back in 1778 with an eye to getting out of Scotland and eventually building a new life in North America. He had been born into minor, low-level nobility in northern England, but after what he called a series of adversities that befell his father, his family was reduced to poverty and sold their land and titles. Duncan McCall commanded deep respect on both sides of the border, dating to his wartime service actions fighting against the American Revolution. But it was most certainly not because of any military heroics that he had been involved in. You see, he was a legendary figure in both Maine and New Brunswick for his wartime track record of narrowly escaping death over and over and over. His series of fortunate events began as soon as he left Britain aboard a military ship heading to North America. On his voyage across the Atlantic, his ship sailing from Scotland to Halifax caught fire, and Duncan McCall barely escaped with his life. He made it to Halifax, and he was immediately sent to the Penobscot Bay in Maine, where he and his fellow British soldiers had to disembark from their ship under fire. This was only 7 days into his time in North America, and just as he was stepping off the ship onto American soil for the first time, he was shot right in the neck. Now, if you remember the episode did about Emile Gauguin in the Spanish Civil War called The Interrogation of Emile Gauguin, we talked a bit about the luck of getting shot. Emile got shot twice in the same place and survived, and author George Orwell, who was also present at the time, got shot in the neck. Orwell famously quipped that as the nurses kept telling him how lucky he was to be alive, he joked that he would have been much luckier if he had not gotten shot at all. Well, Duncan McCall was vastly even more lucky than George Orwell, because when he got shot in the neck, the musket ball hit a metal button on his shirt collar in just the right way that it deflected the bullet, leaving McCall completely unscathed. Duncan McCall, for his part, seemed totally unfazed by this, with his only comment in his diary being a complaint that he didn't know how he would get out the stain the bullet left on his shirt collar. That was just one of his many near brushes with death, though. Later in the war, while Duncan McCall was standing guard at a besieged fort, an 18-pound cannonball whizzed past his head so close that it destroyed his hat. Now, having a great big cannonball come that close to your head in real life isn't like in the movies. The air from the cannonball was so violent that it knocked McCall right off of his feet, and it sent him flying, and the wind from it coming so close struck him so violently that it broke blood vessels in his face and neck, leaving him badly bruised. It just so happened that a British general witnessed McCall's near brush with death. The general came right over while McCall was still dazed and lying on the ground, and he began to joke with him about how lucky he was. McCall, on the other hand, didn't think it was very funny. Not because he had a close brush with death, though, but because the cannonball had shot through his hat, ruining it. He wrote in his diary that he was sad because the cannonball had
struck my fine bunch of feathers which I had in my Highland bonnet. They cost me $8.
$8 for a hat at the time would have been, of course, preposterously expensive. Duncan McCall had another close brush with death in Maine that he considered so insignificant that he didn't bother to mention it in the time in his diary. But this would be the event that would launch his preacher career and would leave him so uniquely positioned that he managed to guide 2 towns towards peace in wartime. More than a decade after the war, Duncan McCall had long since been disbanded from the army, and he was now a traveling preacher. His touring through the Maritimes in New England saw him return to Maine, where he was shocked to learn that he was a legendary figure. He set about investigating how an old story of him, this random low-ranking British soldier, had become so well known. And he was surprised to learn that the man who was spreading it around was none other than the very American commander who had tried to kill him, Colonel Robbins. So Duncan McCall met with Colonel Robbins, and before identifying himself as the soldier in the story, he asked the American colonel to tell him the story that he'd been spreading around the area.
I observed a well-dressed man with his sword drawn in his hand coming from their fort. I knew he had some unfavorable design against us, and I thought it is my duty to cut him off. I ordered my regiment to fire at him.
McCall noted in his diary that he hadn't actually been attacking the Americans, but he had been simply running to deliver a message when the Americans began shooting at him. Colonel Robbins had spotted this lone soldier, and he ordered his whole regiment to fire a rifle volley at him. Much to the colonel's astonishment, his regiment, who he considered to be sharpshooters, all missed. The colonel ordered his men to fire again, once again, they all missed. The Americans reloaded, but Colonel Robbins recalled.
I immediately commanded the men to stop firing at him, saying, God has some work for that man to perform on Earth. Let him alone.
McCall revealed to the American colonel that he was the man from the story, and the colonel was thrilled to learn that he had become a preacher. He figured this showed that he had been right, that God had indeed had plans for the soldier, and therefore the colonel had done the proper thing by ordering his troops to stop shooting at him. McCall, funnily enough, wrote in his diary that he considered the colonel's story to be inaccurate because some very specific details were wrong. In his opinion, the Americans had not actually missed him because one bullet had shot off a clump of his hair, while another bullet had gotten so close to him that it shot the heel right off of his boot. As McCall went to correct the colonel, though, another preacher who was with him cut him off, explaining that rather than quibbling over the details, he should embrace the story because it would make him a very popular preacher. In large part because of this story, dating back to the American Revolution some 30 years earlier, by the time the War of 1812 rolled around and the United States and what is now Canada were at war, Duncan McCall commanded an incredible level of respect in Calais and St. Stephen, where he had since settled. Because of his legendary status evading death in times of war, now that another war was raging, Duncan McCall was uniquely held with such a degree of awe that he alone seemed poised to make a call for peace. The day after the somber Sunday service, his parishioners thought would be the last. The preacher met with the authorities on the Canadian side. In his diary, he revealed that all he had asked for was that
a committee for public safety should be chosen on both sides, who should consult together and maintain peace and order till such a time as troops from either side should take command.
He met with civilian and military leaders on the New Brunswick side, including Sir Thomas Saumarez and Majors Mould and Majors Buck, who, he found,
were of the same mind.
They agreed to create a joint committee for public safety to keep the peace between the two towns at war. With one side's tentative support for peace secured, McCall crossed the border into Calais. As he crossed the border, he noted with some surprise that despite the two nations being at war, the border was still open and unguarded. Instead of meeting with the American leadership, Duncan McCall instead decided to appeal directly to the American people. He called for a public meeting in Calais. The Americans showed up in droves to hear what he had to say. The resulting meeting was, by all accounts, difficult and even hostile. In his diary, McCall attributed the surprising new wave of American hatred to
envy, jealousy, and whatnot.
He found that many Americans were angry that he seemed to be
in favor on all sides.
Despite all the hostility that the meeting began with, by the end of the meeting, the American people in Calais agreed to join the Committee for Public Safety to keep the peace. This was, however, extremely tentative. Their agreement was only that both towns would be temporarily led by the Committee for Public Safety, which was composed of leaders from St. Stephen and Calais, but this was only until the army arrived. As they waited, a wave of disease broke out on the American side, and despite being at war, the Canadian side sent over food and medicine to their neighbors. But the militia from both sides were much slower to arrive than anyone had ever expected. By the time the militia did finally arrive, the public on both sides of the border had grown comfortable with the peace and the security that the two towns enjoyed, even during this time of war. When the militia did arrive in Calais, McCall mentioned briefly that they did not stay very long because they quickly managed to offend the local American people somehow. Unfortunately, McCall didn't elaborate on what happened, and he generally avoided talking about anything he considered political happening on the American side, explaining in his diary.
I feel no enmity to the United States, nor to any other nation in the world. And as to politics, I endeavor to have nothing to do with them, for my kingdom is not of this world, and my wish is to do good to all men.
Kate Gallison, who compiled McCall's diaries, noted that the unique peace enjoyed by Calais and St. Stephen was not exactly popular on the New Brunswick side either.
His enemies in St. Andrews would have had him hanged for it, as if the failure to exhort people to murder their neighbors and burn their houses were an act of treason.
McCall's diary reveals that the plot against him on the Canadian side had been led not by politicians or military officers, but by religious leaders in other New Brunswick towns and cities. The authorities in St. Andrews ordered McCall to be arrested for treason. The punishment for treason was, of course, death. Fortunately for McCall, a lone individual from St. Andrews rushed up to St. Stephen to warn him that magistrates were on their way to arrest him. The magistrates were met in St. Stephen by a large group of people from both sides of the border. This was not an angry mob, though, but rather, this was an entirely silent mob who just stood there watching and looming over the magistrates ominously without saying one single word. As these people surrounded them, McCall calmly talked to the magistrates who had come to arrest him for treason. The only comment he wrote about the standoff in his diary was a little cryptic, saying simply,
"This was quite enough. After this was done, one of these, a magistrate, complimented me on a friendly visit."
The magistrate's failure to arrest McCall did not go over well in New Brunswick, and he wrote of several plots that had been hatched to retaliate against him for seeking peace. He explained in his diary that he kept the New Brunswick side at bay by communicating extensively with the highest military, political, and religious leaders in the province, slowly convincing them of the merits of the Committee for Public Safety's peace. They were ultimately convinced to leave St. Stephen alone. As for the American side, while McCall doesn't get into too much detail in his diary over how their government reacted for fear of being too political, he did note that transportation of food and medicine to Calais was halted, and he makes a genuinely pretty shocking implication that Maine's state government, which was actually based in Massachusetts at the time, had ordered it to be stopped deliberately. The shortage of food and medicine caused a severe outbreak of disease in the winter of 1814. The vast majority of McCall's diary is spent talking about his efforts to help feed, cure, and bury people during the winter. Although Calais did manage to survive the winter, McCall's talk of the funerals that he did that winter implies there was a heavy cost. Among the dead was Sister Watson, whose funeral, McCall wrote, was attended by
a weeping multitude. She was our best.
Contrary to what its name might imply, the War of 1812 lasted 3 years, with a peace agreement being signed on February 18th, 1815. Once again, though, it took a while for the news to arrive in Calais and St. Stephen that the war was over. When it did, McCall wrote,
"On the 1st of March, 1815, the news of peace came to us. What a cause of happiness, of thankfulness.
The news had arrived in the midst of a severe snowstorm, and
the roads were exceedingly bad.
Nonetheless, McCall wrote in his diary,
the people crowded to our meeting house in abundance, giving thanks for the blessing we enjoyed during the war, and now for the return of peace."
Duncan McCall observed that because the two towns on either side of the Maine and New Brunswick border had opted for peace during the 3-year-long war that raged between their nations,
not $1 worth of property was taken by violence from any man. Neither was there any killed, wounded, or taken prisoner amongst us. Instead of judgments, we had wonderful works of grace, such as we never saw in this country before. Neither was there any want of provision, for our own lands supplied our wants, and this was not the case before, since the country was settled.
That was Backyard History with your host, Andrew McLean. Thanks for listening, and stay tuned for another hidden story that happened in your own backyard. produced by Jordan Lozier.